The early morning light filtered through the airport terminal's expansive windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Marcus Thompson moved with practiced efficiency, his leather messenger bag slung casually over his shoulder, a sharp contrast to the crisp navy blue suit that spoke of years of professional discipline. At 35, Marcus was a study in controlled precision. 10 years with the FBI had etched lines of experience around his eyes, telling a story of countless investigations, late nights, and challenging missions. To the casual observer, he was just another professional traveler, tall, well-built, with a posture that suggested military or law enforcement training. But beneath the surface lay a complexity born of navigating a world where his skin color often preceded his achievements. Growing up in Chicago's South Side, Marcus had learned early that perception was a double-edged sword. His parents, his father a high school history teacher, his mother a community nurse, had instilled in him a profound belief in justice tempered by an understanding of systemic challenges. They'd taught him that excellence was his most powerful response to prejudice. His journey to the FBI hadn't been simple. Top of his class at Northwestern University, a master's degree in criminal justice, and years of dedicated service had slowly chipped away at the barriers. Yet, even as a decorated special agent with numerous commendations, Marcus still found himself navigating unspoken tensions, the lingering looks, the subtle shifts in body language, the constant need to prove himself beyond the stereotypes. Today's flight from Chicago to Los Angeles was another routine assignment. An interdepartmental collaboration meeting, complex financial crime investigation, nothing out of the ordinary. But Marcus knew ordinary was a relative term in his world. He checked his watch, a gift from his team after solving a particularly challenging case last year. The stainless steel reflected his image, professional, composed, ready. Years of training had taught him to read rooms, to understand the unspoken, to maintain composure under any circumstance. As he approached the boarding gate, Marcus reflected on the countless flights, the countless encounters. Each journey was a microcosm of a larger narrative, a narrative he was both protagonist and observer in. His FBI badge wasn't just a piece of identification, it was a symbol of resilience, of breaking through barriers, of representing something larger than himself. The gate agent called for boarding. Marcus adjusted his bag, his movements deliberate, his demeanor a careful balance of approachability and professional distance. Another day, another journey, another opportunity to challenge perceptions, one interaction at a time. Little did he know, this flight would become anything but routine. #unexpected encounters, rising tension. The first-class cabin hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-orchestrated space. Marcus settled into his seat, carefully placing his messenger bag in the overhead compartment. His charcoal gray suit was impeccable, a crisp white shirt underneath, and a deep burgundy tie that spoke of understated professionalism. Margaret Holbrook, 72, had been watching him since he approached the seat. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair and pearl earrings suggested years of careful maintenance of appearances, of boundaries, of unspoken social rules. As Marcus adjusted his seatbelt, he caught her sideways glance. It was a look he knew well, a mixture of uncertainty and something more insidious. Years of experience had taught him to read these micro-expressions, to understand the subtext beneath polite surfaces. "Traveling for business?" Margaret asked, her voice pitched with a forced cheerfulness that barely concealed her discomfort. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus responded, his tone neutral, professional. "Work assignment in Los Angeles." The woman's fingers clutched her designer handbag a bit tighter. Marcus noticed he always noticed. Not with anger, but with a weary familiarity that came from a lifetime of such interactions. "And what line of work are you in?" she pressed, her eyes never quite meeting his directly. Marcus could have chosen to minimize the conversation, to retreat into silence. But something in him decided to engage professionally, firmly. "I'm with the FBI, actually. Special agent with the Financial Crimes Division." A moment of silence hung between them. Marcus watched as a series of emotions flickered across Margaret's face: surprise, then a quick recovery, then something that looked remarkably like disappointment that her initial assumptions might be challenged. "How interesting," she managed, her tone suggesting anything but genuine interest. The flight continued. Small comments began to pepper their interaction. Subtle at first references to urban backgrounds, oblique questions about his education, where he was really from. Marcus had heard them all before. Each comment was like a small prod, testing boundaries, seeking to diminish. "You must have been one of those diversity hires," Margaret muttered, just loud enough for Marcus to hear. He took a measured breath. Years of training had taught him that reaction was a choice. Internally, he catalogued the comment not with anger, but with the clinical detachment of a professional who had seen far worse. A flight attendant approached, sensing the tension. "Can I get either of you something to drink?" Marcus smiled, warm, professional. "Water, please." "Thank you." Margaret's request came moments later, her voice slightly more shrill. "I'll have a white wine. Something smooth." The emphasis was intentional. Marcus recognized the coded language, the not-so-subtle attempt to establish some kind of hierarchical social boundary. As the flight progressed, the microaggressions became more pronounced. Whispered comments to nearby passengers. Not-so-subtle shifting away. The kind of behavior designed to make someone feel simultaneously hypervisible and invisible. Marcus worked on his laptop, model of professionalism. But beneath the calm exterior, a lifetime of experience was processing every interaction. He wasn't just Marcus Thompson, FBI agent. He was Marcus Thompson, a black man who had navigated these waters countless times, who understood that his very presence was a statement. Each passive-aggressive comment was met with the same measured response. Polite. Professional. Unbreakable. When Margaret accidentally knocked her wine glass, causing droplets to splash near Marcus's documents, he simply retrieved a handkerchief, cleaned the minimal spillage, and continued working. "Sorry," she muttered, not quite meeting his eyes. Marcus knew this dance. Knew that his response or lack thereof was more powerful than any confrontational comeback. Professionalism was his armor, dignity his most potent weapon. Little did Margaret know, the man sitting next to her was far more than she could comprehend. Each microaggression, each attempt to diminish, was met with a composure that spoke of something deeper, a resilience forged through years of navigating spaces never truly designed for him. The flight continued. Tension simmered. And Marcus Thompson remained exactly who he was, undiminished, unbroken, waiting. #unexpected encounters. The confrontation. The simmering tension reached its boiling point midway through the flight. Margaret's discomfort had morphed from passive-aggressive whispers to a more overt display of hostility. "Excuse me," she called to the nearest flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah, her voice pitched to carry across the first-class cabin. "I want to speak with someone in charge." Sarah approached, her professional smile carefully maintained. "Is there something I can help you with, ma'am?" Marcus continued working on his laptop, seemingly unaware of the brewing confrontation. But every muscle in his body was alert, years of FBI training keeping him attuned to the developing situation. "I do not feel comfortable sitting next to him," Margaret said, her hand making a vague gesture toward Marcus. The word "him" hung in the air, laden with implications. Sarah looked momentarily uncertain. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but our seating arrangements are—" "This is unacceptable," Margaret interrupted, her voice rising. "I paid for a first-class ticket. I expect a certain level of comfort and safety." The word "safety" hung in the air like a barely concealed accusation. Several nearby passengers began to take notice, their conversations dropping to hushed whispers. Marcus slowly closed his laptop, turning to face the unfolding drama. His movement was deliberate, controlled, the kind of measured response that spoke of years of professional training. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice calm and professional. Margaret's face flushed. "I want to speak to the head flight attendant." "This is completely inappropriate. I should not be seated next to—" She trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete her thought. Sarah, caught in an increasingly uncomfortable situation, tried to mediate. "Ma'am, unless there's a specific safety concern, we can't simply move passengers around." "A safety concern?" Margaret's voice rose. "Look at him. How do I know he's not some kind of criminal? How did he even get a ticket in first class?" The racism was now explicit, no longer hidden behind polite veneer. Marcus felt the eyes of other passengers, some sympathetic, some uncomfortable, some quietly supportive. "Ma'am," Marcus spoke, his voice a model of professional restraint, "I'm a special agent with the FBI. I'm traveling on official business." Margaret scoffed. "Right. And I'm supposed to believe that?" The flight attendant, Sarah, looked increasingly uncomfortable. The tension was palpable, a live wire running through the cabin. "I have every right to be on this flight," Marcus continued, "just as you do. My credentials are impeccable, and my purpose here is professional." But Margaret was beyond reason. "I want to speak to the captain. This is unacceptable. I refuse to sit next to someone like him." The racial undertone was unmistakable now. Other passengers began to shift, some looking openly uncomfortable, others showing signs of support for Marcus. A gentleman a few rows back spoke up. "He's an FBI agent. What's the problem?" Marcus appreciated the support but knew that engaging further would only escalate the situation. His years of training had taught him that maintaining composure was key. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I mean you no harm. I'm simply trying to travel to my destination, just like everyone else on this flight." Margaret's face was a mixture of anger and something else, fear, perhaps. The kind of deep-seated fear born of lifelong prejudice and misunderstanding. "I don't care what you say," she hissed. "You don't belong here." The moment hung suspended, a crystallization of every microaggression, every subtle, and not so subtle, racist encounter Marcus had experienced in his life, but Marcus Thompson was more than this moment. More than her prejudice. More than her fear. He was a decorated FBI agent. A son. A professional. A human being, and he would not be diminished. The captain would soon be involved. The other passengers were becoming increasingly uncomfortable. And Marcus knew that this moment was about far more than just a seat on an airplane. It was about dignity. Respect. The fundamental right to exist in a space without justification. The cabin felt electric with tension. Marcus reached slowly into his inner jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and calm. The metallic glint of his FBI badge caught the overhead lighting, casting a subtle reflection that drew every nearby eye. "Special Agent Marcus Thompson, Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said quietly, holding the badge where Margaret and the surrounding passengers could clearly see it. The transformation was instantaneous. Margaret's combative expression crumbled, revealing a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and something deeper, a sudden, uncomfortable confrontation with her own prejudices. Sarah, the flight attendant, leaned in slightly, her professional demeanor giving way to genuine curiosity. "You're actually with the FBI?" she asked, a note of genuine respect replacing her earlier uncertainty. Marcus's journey to the FBI was not a straight path. Growing up in Chicago's South Side, he'd witnessed firsthand the complex interactions between law enforcement and his community. His father, Robert Thompson, had been a high school history teacher who'd always emphasized the importance of breaking cycles of systemic oppression through education and professional achievement. "When I was 12, Marcus began, his voice calm and measured, addressing not just Margaret but the now attentive passengers, "my uncle was wrongfully arrested during a traffic stop. He was a college professor, dressed in a suit, driving a nice car. But because of the color of his skin, he was treated as a suspect." The nearby passengers leaned in, the earlier tension replaced by a collective sense of listening. "That moment changed everything for me," he continued. "I realized that true justice requires people who understand both the law and the human experience behind it. People who can bridge gaps, challenge assumptions, and create real change from within the system." His path hadn't been easy. Top of his class at Northwestern, Marcus had faced countless microaggressions during his academic journey. Law enforcement recruitment, graduate studies, initial FBI training, each stage had been a test not just of his professional capabilities, but of his resilience. The gentleman who had earlier spoken up, a middle-aged white businessman in a tailored suit, nodded sympathetically. "That must have been incredibly challenging," he said. Marcus smiled, a gesture that spoke of hard-earned wisdom. "Challenge is just another word for opportunity," he responded. Margaret sat frozen, the color slowly draining from her face. The realization of her mistake was painful and public. Her earlier bravado had completely disappeared, replaced by a profound sense of shame. She started, then stopped. Words seemed inadequate. Sarah, the flight attendant, looked at Marcus with newfound respect. "I had no idea," she said softly. "The assumptions we make." Another passenger, an older black woman sitting across the aisle, spoke up. "It's not about making no assumptions," she said wisely. "It's about being willing to challenge those assumptions when they're presented with evidence." Marcus appreciated the nuanced perspective. His entire career had been about challenging systemic narratives, about proving that individual excellence could create broader change. The captain approached, having been briefed about the situation. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his tone professional but genuinely concerned. "Everything is fine," Marcus responded, his composure never wavering. "Just an opportunity for understanding." Margaret remained silent, the weight of her actions settling uncomfortably around her. The transformation was remarkable, from aggressive confrontation to stunned silence. "My grandmother always said," Marcus continued, his voice carrying to the nearby passengers, "that fear is just ignorance wearing a mask of protection. Our job, all of our jobs, is to remove that mask, to see each other's humanity." The nearby passengers nodded. The earlier tension had dissolved, replaced by a collective moment of reflection. As the flight continued, conversations continued in hushed, thoughtful tones. Marcus returned to his laptop, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. He wasn't just a passenger anymore, he was a living testament to professional excellence, personal resilience, and the power of quiet dignity. Margaret didn't speak again for the remainder of the flight. But her silence spoke volumes. A confrontation with her own biases, a moment of unexpected education, just another day in the life of Special Agent Marcus Thompson. #Unexpected encounters. The resolution. As the flight approached its final hour, a palpable transformation had taken place in the first-class cabin. Margaret Holbrook, who had begun the journey with such visceral prejudice, now sat in a contemplative silence that spoke louder than her previous outbursts. Tentatively, she turned to Marcus. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice soft and devoid of its earlier hostility. "My behavior was inexcusable." Marcus appreciated the directness. Years of experience had taught him that true growth often emerges from moments of uncomfortable self-reflection. "Acknowledgement is the first step to understanding," he responded diplomatically. The businessman who had earlier spoken up leaned across the aisle. "That was impressive," he said to Marcus. "The way you handled that with such dignity." Marcus understood the broader implications of the moment. This wasn't just about one interaction, one flight, one passenger's prejudice. It was a microcosm of a much larger societal struggle, the constant negotiation of identity, respect, and human understanding. Internally, he reflected on the countless similar encounters throughout his life and career. Each moment was a battle, not just for personal dignity, but for a broader vision of equality. The FBI had been his chosen platform, a way to create change from within a system that had historically marginalized communities like his own. Sarah, the flight attendant, brought Marcus a complimentary drink. "On the house," she said, her earlier nervousness replaced by genuine respect. "I'm sorry about everything that happened earlier." Marcus appreciated the gesture, but more importantly, he appreciated the moment of genuine human connection. Margaret's transformation continued. "My late husband," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "he was a police officer. He always told me that judgment was the easiest path, but understanding required real courage." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Sometimes, the most profound lessons come from the most unexpected sources. Other passengers began sharing their own reflections. A young woman, a graduate student, spoke about unconscious bias training she'd recently undergone. An older gentleman recounted experiences of discrimination he'd witnessed throughout his life. Marcus listened, understanding that each story was a thread in the larger fabric of social progress. Change doesn't happen in grand moments, he found himself saying, addressing the informal group that had formed around his seat. It happens in these small interactions. When we choose understanding over fear. Empathy over assumption. The businessman nodded. Your approach remaining calm, professional, that's true strength. Marcus knew the performance of calm was both a shield and a strategy. Each measured response was a form of resistance, a way of challenging deeply ingrained stereotypes. He wasn't just representing himself, but every black professional who had been underestimated, overlooked, or immediately judged. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the earlier tension had completely dissolved. Margaret turned to Marcus one final time. I have a grandson, she said. He's studying social justice in college. I think I'll tell him about today. About what I learned. It was a small moment. But in the landscape of social progress, small moments create seismic shifts. Marcus thought about his parents, who had taught him that education was the most powerful form of resistance. About his uncle, whose wrongful arrest had set him on this path. About every mentor and colleague who had supported his journey. The FBI badge in his pocket wasn't just an identifier. It was a symbol of possibility. Of what could be achieved when individuals committed to breaking down barriers. As the plane touched down, Marcus reflected on hope. Not the naive hope of immediate transformation, but the sustained hope of continuous effort. The hope that understands progress is a journey, not a destination. Margaret's earlier prejudice hadn't disappeared, but it had been challenged. Challenged by professionalism. By dignity. By an unwavering commitment to see and be seen as a full, complex human being. Just another flight. Just another opportunity for understanding. Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with its typical energy as Marcus collected his bag and prepared to exit. The encounter on the flight seemed to have transformed from a moment of potential conflict to something more profound, a microcosm of larger societal conversations about race, perception, and understanding. At the airport cafe, Marcus took a moment to reflect. His phone buzzed with a message from his mother, Rosa Thompson, a social worker who had spent her entire career fighting for community rights. Heard you had an interesting flight, the message read. Remember, son. Every interaction is an opportunity. Those words had been her mantra, passed down through generations. From her parents who navigated the civil rights movement, to Marcus's own journey in law enforcement, the Thompson family understood that change wasn't about grand gestures, but consistent, dignified resistance. He thought about the research he'd seen, studies showing how personal interactions could dismantle deeply held prejudices. One encounter might not change the world, but it could change a perspective. And perspectives, accumulated, created movements. Later that afternoon, in the FBI field office, Marcus's partner, Elena Rodriguez, noticed something different about him. You're unusually contemplative, she observed, setting down a stack of case files. Marcus shared the flight story, not as a complaint, but as an observation of human complexity. Elena, herself a first-generation American, understood these nuanced experiences intimately. Your restraint, she said, that's real power. Not aggression. Not anger. But a mirror that forces people to see their own assumptions. As weeks passed, the encounter took on a life of its own. Margaret Holbrook, true to her word, began volunteering with a local diversity education program. The businessman from the flight started conversations in his corporate environment about unconscious bias training. Marcus received an unexpected letter. Handwritten, from Margaret. I've been thinking about our flight, it read. About the assumptions I carried. My grandson helped me understand how those assumptions harm people. Thank you for showing me a different perspective. It wasn't an apology. It was an acknowledgement. A beginning. His work with the FBI continued investigating financial crimes, building cases that required meticulous attention to detail. Each case was another opportunity to challenge systemic barriers, to prove that excellence transcends racial boundaries. During a department training session, Marcus was asked to speak about navigating professional spaces as a black agent. Professionalism isn't about making others comfortable, he told the room of young agents. It's about being uncompromisingly excellent. About understanding that your very presence is a statement. Your work is your most powerful testimony. The personal philosophy he developed wasn't about avoiding conflict, but transforming it. Each microaggression was an opportunity for education. Each moment of potential tension, a chance for understanding. Years later, at a conference on diversity in law enforcement, the flight would become a subtle legend. Not as a story of confrontation, but as a nuanced example of how individual interactions could create broader social change. Marcus thought about his younger self, the child who watched his uncle's wrongful arrest, who decided that change could come from within systems, not just by fighting against them. The epilogue of that flight wasn't just about Margaret or Marcus. It was about the potential for human beings to grow, to challenge their own narratives, to choose understanding over fear. As the sun set over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the city, Marcus understood that hope wasn't a destination. It was a continuous journey of small, consistent actions. Of seeing humanity in unexpected places. His phone buzzed. Another case. Another opportunity, another chance to make a difference.